Marlene, good to see you. I know you sit in Vienna, I sit in Bloomington, but here we are together with a great many people from many different countries, eager to hear what you're going to tell us today in your talk. I say to myself, believe it or not, but I do believe it. We've now produced 32 webinars on contemporary anti-Semitism in the last year and a half. And following yours, we have 10 more to go in the present series. And our goal is always the same, to direct the most serious attention that we can to the pathology that is, in fact, present-day anti-Semitism. It takes many forms. It exists on the right, it exists on the left, it exists within radicalized forms of Islamism and elsewhere as well. And we do our best, in fact, to focus attention on all of those things. With Marlene's help today, we're going to take a hard look at present-day developments as refracted through the wisdom of one of the Holocaust's most important writers, Jean Améry. Marlene will tell us a good deal about his life and his writings. I'm proud to say, in fact, that Indiana University Press has just brought out her new book, Jean Améry Essays on Anti-Semitism and the Left. Prior to that, and I'm doubly proud to say, Indiana University brought out a book translated by my brother and sister-in-law, Sidney and Stella Rosenfeld. In fact, here is the book, At the Mind's Limits, Contemplations by a Survivor on Auschwitz and its Realities. I have no hesitation whatsoever in saying that Jean Améry is one of the most important essayists on the experience of the Jews during the Nazi period. He went through terrible times himself, as you'll no doubt soon learn, but survived in order to give us some of the most thoughtful reflections we have. Another goal of this series is, in fact, to showcase not only the most accomplished veteran scholars of anti-Semitism, but bring to the fore younger scholars as well. And Marlene, really, it's a pleasure to have you. We're going to look to you and others of your generation to succeed us in order to keep going serious attention on what deserves and requires serious attention, the resuscitation of Jew hatred in our own time. Very briefly, Marlene studied political science, philosophy, history, Jewish studies, and Austrian studies at the University of Vienna and also at the University of Maryland, where she studied with Jeffrey Herf, who's probably going to be listening in today. Jeffrey, if so, you can take pride in your former student. She is one of the editors of an important journal based in Vienna. It's a biannual German language journal dedicated to social and cultural analyses within the tradition of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. She's been active in running educational programs in Germany and Austria, also in Israel from time to time, and she's lectured and published widely on anti-Semitism, post-war German society, post-Shoah, memory and philosophy and related subjects. Marlene, do you happen to have a copy of your new book with you? If so, show it. There it is. Very good. As you will hear a little bit later, Indiana University Press is pleased to make this book and other books that we produce available to everyone who's registered for this webinar at a 30% discount. And Günther will say some more about that later. Marlene, it's now my pleasure to hand over to you. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about Jean Améry's critique of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism on the left. With this book, I also want to thank the translator Lars Fischer for his exceptional translation from German into English. And yes, the book is now available worldwide. Améry tends to be known, if at all, for his reflections on being a Shoah victim. The latter were of crucial importance to him, but Améry rejected attempts to categorize him exclusively as a professional Nazi victim. With this talk and with this book, I'm hoping to draw attention to a different dimension of Améry's work, his spirited interventions against the new anti-Semitism, in which he demonstrated that the present cannot be separated from the past. Today, I will first give you a biographical overview and the historical context in which Améry wrote the essays that were initially published between 1966 and 1978, before I discuss his insights directly. As you will see, Améry's critique appears as if it had been written in response to the current situation, as if he had warned against later developments of a left that has betrayed its own principles. He undeniably was an extraordinarily perceptive and sharp critic of anti-Semitism and rampant anti-Zionism we are still confronted with today. Jean Améry was born in 1912 as Hans Meyer in Vienna. When he was 4 years old, his father was killed in the First World War while fighting in the Austro-Hungarian army. Améry and his mother moved from Vienna to a small town in the Austrian Salzkammergut region, where Valerie Meyer ran a guest house and a bar. The father had been very proud of his Jewish descent. Yet Judaism never played any great role in Améry's upbringing. If anything, he was more familiar with Christian traditions because his mother was Catholic. A few years later, the mother's guest house went bankrupt and the two moved back to Vienna. When Améry was 17, he moved to Berlin, where he made ends meet as a casual laborer. In 1930, he returned to the Austrian capital and trained as a bookseller. During this time, Améry attended lectures on philosophy and literature at the Viennese Adult Education Center, Volkshochschule Leopoldstadt. Since 1932, Améry himself was an associate there. At that time, he was significantly influenced by philosophers of the Vienna Circle, namely Moritz Schlick and Rudolf Carnap. When he was 21, Améry officially resigned from the Jewish community, a step he would later reverse. In the mid-1930s, together with his friend Ernst Meyer, Améry edited the literary journal Die Brücke, The Bridge. He also wrote his first novel, Die Schiffbrüchigen, The Castaways, which was sent to Thomas Mann and Robert Musil to review the manuscript. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws came into force in Germany. Améry was highly alert to the increasing anti-Semitic discrimination. It was a caesura for his self-understanding as a Jew. In 1937, he re-entered the Jewish community. After the Anschluss, Austria's incorporation into the Greater German Reich, Améry fled from anti-Semitic persecution to Belgium. Just 1.5 years later, Germany annexed Belgium and he was arrested for the first time. He was deported to Camp de Saint-Cyprien. He managed to escape from the moving train but was arrested again. Améry was handed over to German authorities and subsequently taken to Gurs, an internment camp in southern France. It was the same camp where, among others, Hannah Arendt and Dora Benjamin, Walter Benjamin's sister, were imprisoned. After a full year, Améry managed to escape again. He made his way through Paris back to Brussels, where he joined the communist resistance against the Germans. In 1943, Améry was caught distributing leaflets with anti-Nazi propaganda. As a political prisoner, he was brutally tortured. When his captors realized that he was Jewish, he was deported to Auschwitz concentration camp in German-occupied Poland. While as a political prisoner, he had still been an individual. As a Jewish prisoner, he had become a mere cipher. The treatment he suffered was no longer related to anything he did or did not do. In January of 1945, as the Red Army drew close and the Germans evacuated Auschwitz, Améry was forced to march to Gleiwitz II concentration camp. From there, he was deported to Mittelbau-Dora in Germany, and then north to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. On April 15, 1945, British forces liberated the remaining prisoners of Bergen-Belsen. Of the 25,437 Jews the Germans deported from Belgium, Améry was one of just 615 survivors. He returned to Belgium. Soon after the war, Améry met Jean-Paul Sartre in Brussels. Sartre would become the most influential philosopher for his thinking after Auschwitz. Améry certainly had no intention to move back or to publish anything in Germany or Austria, the countries of the perpetrators. Well into the 1960s, he earned his keep by writing commissions, mostly for a Swiss news agency. To illustrate his dissociation from German culture, he changed his name from Hans Meyer to the French anagram Améry. In the early 1960s, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem and the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt drew considerable attention, suggesting that the West German public was beginning to confront the issue of the Shoah. Against the backdrop of this emerging change in attitudes and the possibility to find an audience, Améry for the first time spoke openly about his experiences as a Jewish victim of the Nazis. Thanks to an editor at Süddeutscher Rundfunk, a large West German public radio station, Améry was given the opportunity to record his autobiographically grounded reflections on being a Shoah victim. They were broadcast between 1964 and 1966 and later made available in print as Jenseits von Schuld und Sühne, which is available, as Alvin already mentioned, in English as At the Mind's Limits, Contemplations by a Survivor on Auschwitz and its Realities. The book's success gave Améry the financial freedom to quit commissions and to publish his own analysis of current affairs in various West German newspapers and journals. In this context, he repeatedly took issue with contemporary anti-Semitism and was the first to raise the alarm about its extraordinary virulence among radical leftists and especially in the New Left. But Améry's fight was a fight against windmills. The fact that his critique largely fell on deaf ears among the leftist addressees was not the only reason for Améry's suicidal thoughts, but it did play a role. In an interview he gave in 1976, he explained, I quote, "I was also disappointed by the left, and this has profoundly affected me in a personal way, and this disappointment is closely connected to suicidal thoughts. All the mindless and rabid anti-Israelism, which has become de rigueur, as much as a matter of course as class consciousness, that Israel is an imperialist outpost and must be destroyed. I feel a deep affinity for the state of Israel because I am aware of the fate of those Jews to whom no such refuge was available. But it is entirely impossible to broach this topic with leftists." End of quote. Throughout his adult life, Améry had considered himself a leftist, but he was now confronted with the fact that his former comrades in arms were inciting anti-Semitism. As a result, having lost his cultural home, German Austria, in the 1930s, Améry now also lost his political home, the left. His already impaired trust in the world was further diminished, which rendered his critique all the more acute. After at least one failed attempt at suicide, Améry took his own life on October 17th, 1978, in a hotel room in Salzburg, Austria. In the years following World War II, the West German left had been relatively well disposed towards the young Jewish state. Proponents of the old left were, for instance, driving the efforts of restitution and criticizing the widespread apathy among the German public towards the crimes committed against the Jews. It was the left, mainly the Social Democrats and trade unions, that pushed the German government to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. But in the 1960s, large parts of the non-aligned so-called New Left soon embraced anti-Semitic positions and turned on the Jews with great speed and ferocity. As the student movement in West Germany reached its peak, demonstrators were calling for the death of Zionists. In 1969, leftist activists in Kiel protested against a lecture by the Hebrew University's vice president for research, Alexander Kanan, a microbiologist, by distributing flyers with the line, "Strike the Zionist dead, make the East red." The Socialist German Student League, SDS, in Frankfurt wrote "Down with the chauvinist, racist state of Israel," a slogan we still hear today with various ornamentations. The same year, the group Tupamaros West Berlin did not leave it at verbal attacks and desecrated Jewish memorials with the slogans Shalom and Napalm, and others with Al-Fatah. They deposited a firebomb in West Berlin's Jewish Community Center on November 9th, 1969, the 31st anniversary of the November pogroms. They justified their actions by claiming the Zionists were the new fascists, and the real anti-fascism was the solidarity with the Fedayeen. In 1976, members of the revolutionary cells, together with Palestinian members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, hijacked an aircraft on the way from Tel Aviv to Paris to force the release of Palestinian militants imprisoned in Israel. The plane, with its 248 passengers, was diverted to Entebbe in Uganda, where the kidnappers separated the hostages into Jews and non-Jews, allowing only the latter to leave. When one of the victims, who was a survivor of the Shoah, showed hijacker Wilfried Böse the number tattooed on his arm, Böse famously protested, "I'm no Nazi, I'm an idealist." And his reaction was symptomatic. After Auschwitz, it has become frowned upon to avow oneself an anti-Semite. Surely, there were, and there still are today, some old-school anti-Semites that openly admit to hating Jews. But at least in the West, they have become the minority. The anti-Semitism after the Shoah has become largely an anti-Semitism without anti-Semites. At the very center of Améry's thinking was his experience as a Jewish Nazi victim, an experience that was impossible to leave behind, and that made it near impossible to find a place in the world afterwards. Améry had not considered himself a Jew, aside from the occasional comment by a classmate or the brawl with an Austrian fascist long before Hitler came to power on the ramp of the University of Vienna, in which Améry proudly lost a tooth. He had not considered himself a Jew until the Nazi racial laws came into force. In his essay on the impossible obligation to be a Jew, he wrote, I quote, "It only began in 1935 when, poring over the paper in a cafe in Vienna, I studied the Nuremberg laws, which had just come into force in Germany. I only needed to skim through them to realize that they applied to me. Society, in the guise of the National Socialist German state, formally and with all possible clarity, had just made a Jew of me. Or rather, they had lent my pre-existing knowledge of my Jewishness, which had previously been of little consequence, a whole new dimension. I now understood that being a Jew meant being a dead man on furlough, somebody who was to be murdered, who by mere coincidence was not yet where he ought by rights to be. The world was content with the positions the German had assigned to us, both the small world inside and the big world outside the camp. Rarely did the latter heroically stand up to be counted when, in the dark of night, we were taken from our flats in Vienna or Berlin, in Amsterdam, Paris, or Brussels. The human rights declarations, the democratic constitutions, the free world, and the free press, nothing can lull me into the sense of security again, of which I was disabused in 1935. End of quote. Améry drew on Jean-Paul Sartre, specifically his Anti-Semite and Jew, which the French existentialist philosopher published just shortly after the war. Three insights were crucial for Améry and can be found throughout his own work. First, there is no Jewish problem, but a problem of anti-Semitism. The reasons for anti-Semitism have nothing to do with the Jews, but with the projective needs of the anti-Semite. When trying to grasp anti-Semitism, it is wrong-headed to look at the Jews to understand the hatred against them. It's necessary to look at the anti-Semites. For his own psychological relief, I quote Sartre, "If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him." Second, the anti-Semite puts the Jew into a position in which he is made a Jew by others. Améry could not define his Jewishness in positive terms. He was not raised Jewish. He had no connection to the traditions, to the culture. He was an atheist. And yet he could not escape the anti-Semite's verdict by how he looked, what he said, what he did. For the Jews, the freedom of being able to decide one's own identity, unfortunately, is a false promise. To have a true and lucid consciousness of this situation, instead of denying it, constitutes, according to Sartre, and without any value judgment, the so-called authentic Jew. And third, there is an inherent death threat to anti-Semitism. The Jews are imagined, and this holds true until today, they are imagined as powerful, as secretly pulling the strings, as being responsible for everything bad happening, and hence they are seen as the ultimate evil that has to be eradicated. The anti-Semitic Manichaean worldview leads to extermination out of pure delusion, to extermination for the sake of extermination. Auschwitz, and that makes the Shoah unprecedented until today, has shown that reason or even the self-preservation drive of the perpetrators cannot be trusted. In Sartre's words, what the anti-Semite wishes, what he prepares for, is the death of the Jew. Améry deliberately uses the term catastrophe Jew. He writes, "Every Jew is a catastrophe Jew exposed to a catastrophic fate, whether he realizes or not." About the inescapability of anti-Semitism, no matter what the Jew does or does not do, he explains, I quote, "For the anti-Semite, the Jew must always be gotten rid of, no matter what he actually does. Compelled to be a merchant, he is considered a bloodsucker. If he is an intellectual, he supposedly subverts the existing world order with diabolical intent. As a soldier, he is a colonialist. As a soldier, a cruel oppressor. If he is willing to assimilate into his respective host society, the anti-Semite considers him a dishonorable interloper. If the Jew too lays claim to that fashionable and much celebrated phenomenon, a national identity, one calls him a racist." End of quote. History is proof that calling this an exaggeration or relativizing the threat has lethal consequences. Anti-Semitism has not dissolved after World War II. It has continued to exist, and a new attempt at the annihilation of Jews is not out of question. Although before the Shoah, nobody could really imagine that it was possible, Now it is clear that it can happen again as long as anti-Semitism persists. Améry noted in 1966, I quote, "It is conceivable, of course, although the current circumstances make it far from likely, that the final act of the historical drama, that is the persecution of the Jews, was played out in the Nazis' death camps. It seems to me, however, that the dramaturgy of anti-Semitism persists. The possibility cannot be ruled out that the systematic annihilation of large numbers of Jews could recur." End of quote. Améry argues that anti-Semitism prevents the Jews' stance on Israel from being a matter of volition. For every Jew the world over, the question of Israel is an existential one. Israel is the only place in the world Jews do not depend on the goodwill of others. Assimilation in the 19th and 20th century has failed, not because of the Jews, because not enough of those others were there to save them when the Nazis took them. No one can promise that this would be different in the future. Since the state of Israel exists, the Jews have a virtual asylum to fall back on, no matter what. I emphasize the term virtual, Améry writes. What is important to all of them is the option, the existence of a potential asylum. The vast majority of leftists did not care about the particularities of anti-Semitism, much like today. I will get back to that later. Instead, many simply subsumed Nazism under the term of fascism and ignored the fact that anti-Semitism was at the core of Nazi ideology and actions. Instead of grasping the Jews' unique situation, what became prevalent among the different groups of non-aligned leftists in the 1960s and 70s was a mindless glorification of third world national liberation struggles and fierce anti-imperialism. Améry warns against this development early on. On the eve of the Six-Day War, he states, I quote, "What is the point of condemning American imperialism? To be sure, it exists, or to be more precise, America absolutely is pursuing a policy of belligerent violence in Vietnam, but this has nothing to do with the crisis in the Middle East, where it is, after all, not the Americans who are threatening to wipe out a small country." End of quote. Améry criticizes the left for their blind support of authoritarian regimes. He had a fine sense for the left contradicting itself and revealing their own untruths. The anti-authoritarian West German left was openly supporting authoritarian regimes. Not every third world regime that calls itself revolutionary actually pursues genuine social revolutionary policies, he writes. Algeria is no more a revolutionary state than Gaddafi's Libya, with its paroxysms of Islamic fanaticism. As you see, Améry was also an early critic of Islamism, which since has only taken more lives and has its adherents in Europe and North America today as well. Throughout his texts, he points out the manifest threat by the surrounding Arab states and warns against the consequences of the Arab ambitions. I quote again, "Only a shred of imagination is required to envision what would occur if Israel were destroyed. Fleeing the sword of the Prophet Muhammad, the Jewish survivors, retransformed into the mythical wandering Jews, would spread out across the globe, and the world would again react as it did after 1933, when underpopulated states like Canada and Australia closed their doors to the Jews as though they were carriers of the plague." End of quote. Améry breaks down the myth of the peaceful coexistence in Muslim countries. Quote, "The supporters of the Arab cause frequently argue that in the world of Islam, in contrast to the Christian Occident, the Jews have always coexisted peacefully and amicably with the Muslims. Albert Memmi has demonstrated in a richly documented book that this was by no means the case. Under Muslim rule, the Jews were always second-class citizens, where they were able to work their way up the ranks. As was the case in Al-Andalus, their status nevertheless continued to be precarious. At best, they were tolerated, but they were never genuinely accepted. This has not changed, end of quote. But back to the left. The reasons for their political convictions and actions must have been lying elsewhere. Why would they fight, at least ideologically, on the side of dictators? Améry argues that the well-disposition towards the Jews and the Jewish state during the first 2 decades after World War II had been a cheap paying off their guilty feelings. He supposes that the early solidarity with Israel was mainly driven by the leftist Germans' own emotional needs. With the Six-Day War in 1967, the psychological restraints were lost. Finally, the Germans could blame the Jews as oppressors. Finally, the Germans could feel morally superior. Améry writes, quote, "For years, to take the German case, one celebrated the armed Israelis and not least the stylish girls in uniform tilling the Israeli soil. Obvious feelings of guilt were thus discharged in a tainted currency, which was always going to become tiresome. Fortunately, for once, the Jew, instead of being burned, has now emerged as the imperious victor and occupying power. The country, Germany, breathed a sigh of relief." End of quote. For the bad conscience, it's comforting to imagine the victim of yesterday as the aggressor of today. And so the left did. Some spoke of the criminal state of Israel. Some described the Jewish state as the bridgehead of American imperialism in the Middle East. And all of them were sure of themselves they were no anti-Semites. They vehemently denied it whenever the suspicion arose. That is what was new in the 1960s and what Améry saw so early on. Not the anti-Zionism itself, that had existed before. Alfred Rosenberg, the famous Nazi ideologue, for instance, claimed that Zionism was the militant wing of world Jewry. In the fact that the anti-Semite thought of himself as standing on the right side of history, fighting for the good of humankind, was also nothing new. New was the steadfast declaration not to be anti-Semitic. We are seeing this today. The leftists insisted they intended no harm to Jews. That's what's meant when speaking of anti-Semitism without anti-Semites. And yes, this phenomenon lives on successfully to this day. Améry piercingly points out, quote, "The anti-Semitism we are confronted with today does not speak its name. On the contrary, if one tries to hold it to account, it disowns itself. It is no easy task to drag it before the court that has long since condemned it, but would nevertheless need to be in constant session. How does the new anti-Semite present himself? His contention is extremely straightforward and perfectly plausible. All claims to the contrary notwithstanding, he is no anti-Semite. He is in fact an anti-Zionist." But anti-Zionism, according to Améry, is just a new, updated face of anti-Semitism, updated to meet the contemporary socially accepted norms. The two are not two separable phenomena. The emotional infrastructure of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is the same. The unwillingness of the old and the new anti-Semite to be educated and to see the historical facts is the same. The victims in both cases are the same. The inherent death threat is the same, and the indifference at best or the hostility of the rest of the world is the same. Anti-Semitism, Améry observes, resides in anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism as the thunderstorm does in the cloud, and it has become respectable again. Anti-Zionism is what Améry calls the virtuous anti-Semitism, even though there really is nothing virtuous to it. The anti-Zionist self-righteously pats himself on the shoulder. No reflection is allowed. The old anti-Semitism and the new go hand in hand. I quote Améry again. Classical anti-Semitism is taking a contemporaneous guise, yet its previous guise too lives on, a rare case of genuine coexistence. The past stays with us and will continue to stay with us in the form of the crooked-nosed and bow-legged Jew forced to flee by one circumstance or another, or rather by them all. This is also how you will see him on Arab propaganda posters and pamphlet covers. The relevant new notions reared their head in the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War and are gradually gaining ground. They hinge on the Israeli oppressor trampling peaceable Palestinian land underfoot with the iron tread of Roman legions. Today's anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism of yesteryear find themselves in absolute agreement. End of quote. The West German student movement that claimed to rebel against their parents' Nazi generation only did so at first glance. Améry had called on the young generation of Germans to break with their father, but in fact, they dragged on the old Jew hatred in an updated manner. Without doubt, the outspoken humanist he was, Améry acknowledges the difficult situation of the Palestinians. In the conflict in the Middle East, legitimate claim is pitted against legitimate claim, Améry declares. That being said, he also emphasizes a crucial difference. Quote, I would add, however, that the two parties are not endangered in equal measure, be it in the guise of the Saudi despot who is circulating the protocols of the elders of Zion, the religiously obsessed Gaddafi, the ostensibly moderate Sadat, or the self-avowed Marxist Habash. The fact of the matter is that the Arab nation is hell-bent on eradicating the state of Israel, rather like one Herr Göring once hoped to do with the English cities. End of quote. Israel cannot afford to lose just one war. It would be the end of the Jewish state and the Jews living in it. Améry stresses that for Israel, it's about the life of every single one of its inhabitants, whereas for the Palestinians, the question of their own statehood would be easy to solve if they wanted to. According to Améry, the one thing they had to do was to unreservedly accept the existence of the Jewish nation state, and all other issues could be resolved with a reasonable measure of intelligence and goodwill. Améry stresses the leftists' failure to realize that looking at the full picture, the Jews are the more vulnerable party. The mantra of the left, to always stand on the side of the weak, is turned upside down by their anti-Zionism. Améry tries to reason with the young leftists, showing them that they are betraying their own principles. After all, the left, Améry writes, if it understands its role correctly, is a child of the Enlightenment. He urges it to, quote, shake off its guerrilla metaphysics and finally, just for once, do what it constantly claims on every suitable and unsuitable occasion to be doing, namely to reflect intellectually on a given situation. Today, more than ever, it should emphatically subscribe to the sentiment Sartre expressed in an interview during the Yom Kippur War. All I know is that in this conflict, 3 million people are pitted against 100 million. End of quote. Améry calls on the left to redefine itself by revisiting the problem of Israel, that is the Jewish problem. His plea is as relevant today as it was 50 years ago. Since Améry wrote his essays, a major new threat to the Jewish state has entered the stage: the Islamic Republic of Iran. The regime in Tehran, with its proxies throughout the Middle East, openly vows to destroy Israel. And yet, at the United Nations, Germany has condemned Israel more times than it has condemned Iran. German politicians claim that the existence of the Jewish state was Germany's raison d'etat, reason of state. And yet, in 2020, Germany voted 13 times against Israel and only once against Iran. Every year, at the end of Ramadan, the so-called Al-Quds Day is celebrated on the streets of German cities. It was initiated by the Islamic regime to campaign against the Jewish state. The left either looks away or sympathizes with the demonstrators who frequently chant anti-Semitic slurs on the streets of Berlin. This year, the Al-Quds Day even was included in Berlin's police calendar of cultural diversity. The classical anti-imperialism today has retreated to some leftist fringe groups. However, it has been replaced by post-colonialism and fashionable theories of critical whiteness. Similar to Améry's observation that many leftists falsely subsumed Nazism under the term of fascism and therefore systematically ignored anti-Semitism, we are witnessing today how harmful it is to subsume anti-Semitism under the term of racism. This relativizes anti-Semitism to an alarming degree. In its worst appearances of present-day anti-racism, Jews are seen as white and privileged. The old anti-Semitic trope of the powerful, deceiving Jew has returned dressed in new clothes. Memory of the Shoah cannot be limited to museums and ritualistic speeches. The bare minimum that memory of the Shoah has to bring about is that the Jews can live safely today. Améry brings to mind what it means to take Theodor Adorno's categorical imperative that mankind has to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen seriously. As long as anti-Semitism exists, the state of Israel as a potential refuge for Jews the world over is indispensable. This is what Améry showed. Améry cannot, and that may be one of the reasons why his essays have received so little attention so far, be used to reconcile with the past or to forget the specifics of Nazism in order to create a general human rights discourse, which is then turned to agitate against the Jewish state. I conclude with a quote by Améry. The Jew knows that as long as Israel exists, one will not be able to stick him into the fiery furnace again with the tacit support of the inhospitable host peoples or accompanied by their non-committal pity at best.